All right, welcome, y'all. First of all, sorry for being absent on Monday. I was pretty sick for a while. I'm still having some lung stuff, but doctor says it's okay to come back Wednesday. This is going to be lecture 10. We're going to be talking about bureaucracies. It'll be a pretty short lecture. I'm going to post the Canvas slides so you can follow along. Yeah, that's it. And then I will see you on Wednesday and we'll get right back on track. Okay, so. First of all, the basics. Just as we've learned, bureaucracy is an appendage of the executive branch. It's generally run by the president or the governor or your mayor or your city planner, whatever it might be, but it's executive branch, right? Bureaucracies, according to Max Weber, from the turn of the sort of 20th century, he was a really famous critic of governments and how they work and why they expand and all of these sorts of things, right? But he says that these bureaucratic institutions generally have five characteristics. They have a division of labor, you focus on what you're an expert at. They have a built in hierarchy. If you look at these organizational structure charts that they have in some of these things, they are massive and incredibly detailed. They have formal rules, of course, right? Institutions, in a sense, are ruled. Um, you have the maintenance of files and records, right? This is very important for government work. And according to Weber, like there's a lot of just paper pushing and record making. And then you have professionalization and merit in hiring and leadership and all of these sorts of things, right? And bureaucracy has two main roles that we can discuss. The first is to implement policy, and the second to interpret policy, right? And I probably got those backwards. You've got to interpret it before you implement it. But these are the two main roles. All right, the next slide, policy implementation. There are a couple reasons why bureaucracies and governments, et cetera, exist, right? I mean, there are just some things that are not going to be provided by the market, right? If you think about things like roads, right, you don't want to have to pay the local, I don't know, sort of wealthy guy to use every road that he built out for you, right? Like that would be extraordinarily expensive. It could get exploitative, right? These sorts of things, right? And so government steps in, uh, and we can have an argument about like what can and cannot be provided by the market, right? But there are some things that just generally can't be provided by the market. There are also problems like the tragedy of the commons, right? You have to have a rule structure to make sure like a fishery doesn't just get overfished and disappear, and these sorts of things, right? And there can be efficiencies in government markets or government provided goods, right? Not only can they not be provided by the market often, but there are efficiencies of scale, right? If you're building out a highway system, it's probably best to plan at the grand scale rather than having like individual local contractors deal with each and every portion of this, which could get wildly expensive, right? And so we know as a concept of economics, the larger your purchases, the more of a discount you tend to get, right? There are also arguments about making private companies bid for contracts keeps government spending low and efficacious, right? You're forcing people to compete for those contracts. Now, problems like corruption and others can obviously water that down, right? But at least theoretically, it should be efficacious. Okay. To implement policy, also, you have to enforce laws, right? Like you can't just say this law is on the books and then it gets ignored, right? Like this is often what happens in very weak states, right? Places like, say, India or places in sub-Saharan Africa or post-communist Eastern Europe, right? Yes, you have institutions. Yes, you're setting down rules, but do people follow them? And do you have the institutional capacity to enforce them, right? This is very important. Um, and so we have lots of different laws and regulations that have to be enforced, and they are not just sort of policing, right, like criminal acts, but you also have financial investigations, right? Tax avoidance, cheating on taxes, monopoly laws, all kinds of stuff that has to be dealt with by the FTC, the Justice Department, um, the Federal Consumer Protection Bureau, the Environmental Protection Agency. All of these different sorts of bureaucracies not only sort of provide expertise and stuff, but they're also charged to enforce crimes. And this was one of the problems with like the 2008 financial crash, is that like all of these laws were on the books. They didn't seem to give a shit, right? I mean, they were just breaking laws left and right, and making risky investments and all of these sorts of things, and no one went to jail on this stuff, right? And so this problem of enforcement can become important. They also have to sort of just manage programs, right? They have to set budgets, they have to hire, they have to provide a hierarchy, all of these sorts of things. So there's a lot that goes on inside of bureaucracies. Okay, the second role, policy interpretation, right? There are three ways you can really look at this, right? And it sort of depends on what we call level of analysis in economics and political science, etc. So you have the sort of street level decisions, right? You have the cops, you have the health inspector, you have the scientists who are going around testing, environmental rivers and lakes and all of this kind of stuff, right? And so you have these street level decisions that have to be made, and you have this sort of enforcement at the street level. We also have to make rules, right? We've talked about a bunch of times in this class before that politicians tend to be lawyers. They don't really have a whole lot of expertise. They'll put together sort of this philosophical approach to many, public issues. But when it comes down to the nitty gritty, this tends to get passed on to the bureaucracy, the experts, the scientists. There are a couple different philosophical ways to look at this, right? Some say, look, that's anti-democratic. They didn't get elected in by anybody. Why are they making rules? Some say, look, we want experts to make rules. We don't want to lean on, these um, sort of philosophical, moralist, the people who are more concerned about votes than they are about governance, right? So there's arguments on both sides. Um, but laws at some point have to become detailed coded instructions, right? And this is generally the state administrative code, which under the Chevron rules, basically from the Supreme Court, basically holds the weight of law in American jurisprudence. Okay, the third is pushing policy agendas. So we got to remember that this is part of politics too, right? And so even the bureaucratic leaders have to worry about how their governors and their Congress people want the laws implemented. How much enforcement do they want, right? This sort of thing. And so usually this is sort of the leadership level of these bureaucratic entities, right? Because a lot of the bureaucracies don't really have churn, but the leadership does, depending on which administration is in power. And so they have to sort of balance out all of the above that we've talked about, but also the politics of it. How do you represent your constituency or the ruling party in your state or the governor, et cetera, right? And there are a handful of what we consider to be protected institutions that cannot be influenced by political leaning, right? By political strong arming, these sorts of things. And generally, historically, these have been the Fed, right, who controls inflation rates. Um, this is under fire under Trump. He is going after Fed Chairman Jerome Powell over the expenditures for their, building remodel or something. I don't know. But there's a lot of frustration from both parties about this. The Justice Department is another Again, this is changing. It seems the Justice Department is getting a little bit more political over the last few cycles. And then the courts, which have also been under attack by many. So this is in flux at the moment. Okay, next slide. Scope. So we've talked about before as well. There are about 2.5 to 3.5 million federal employees at any given time. A lot of this is based in the Postal Service and the military. So actually, the federal government, employee wise, is pretty damn small, especially relative to state and local bureaucracies, because state bureaucracies have 3.5 million full time employees. Local bureaucracies have about another 11 to 12 million full time employees. And then amongst state and local, there are an additional, probably around 4.5 to 5.5 million part time employees, right? So, there's a lot of complaint about the size of the federal government in America, but the federal government is pretty bare bones relative to the state and local levels. Um, Also, sort of the size of bureaucracy, according to research, is based on population density. And there's a negative correlation where the more dense your population, the fewer bureaucrats you have per capita, right? And this is simply because of some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, like economies of scale, efficiencies, etc. If you live in, rural Wyoming, the local doula or I don't know, nurse for pregnant women or whatever it might be is just an example. Is going to be able to see far fewer clients than someone in New York City or Nashville or Austin, Texas, whatever it might be, right? And so there's this sort of inevitable increase in per capita bureaucrats the more rural and spread out you become. Okay. The next slide, bureaucracy in American history. Bureaucracy has changed dramatically. Much of bureaucracy was privatized during our sort of founding, not only because we were just becoming a country, but this is sort of the mindset of the sort of Protestant Western history, right? Um, and it comes from writers like John Locke and Rousseau and Madison and Hamilton, Jefferson. All of these people, were very skeptical of concentrated power. Um, and so things like schools and libraries and fire departments and all of these sorts of things tended to be pretty privatized, right? And if you watch a really famous show from HBO called John Adams, you can even see this in the first couple of episodes where there's this sort of volunteer fire department and it's freezing and they're having a hard time even getting water from the tap for their little push cart fire truck. It was fascinating, right? But yeah, the government has become more and more involved as we've moved on, especially in the post World War II period, where we saw sort of a blossoming of bureaucratic institutions. Staffing was largely aristocratic, right? Like the very, very elite, the wealthy, the educated, right? Because education even was pretty limited at that time. But this started to change around the middle of the 19th century during the sort of Andrew Jackson period. And we've talked about this too before. But this is where we introduce sort of the spoils system. I'll give you jobs if you support my reelection, or you bring in votes, or you bring in I don't know, like campaign donations, these sorts of things, right? And so we get the rise of machine politics in some of the major cities, like especially like Chicago and New York. You get the doling out of government jobs and contracts to sort of politically connected cronies rather than having them make a bid for it or these sorts of things. And corruption starts to rise drastically, right? There are all kinds. You sort of look through the Gilded Age history of presidents and their close confidants who were arrested or who had corruption trials and these sorts of things, right? Okay, next slide. We move towards sort of the progressive movement, right? We're moving out of the Gilded Age. we're moving into sort of the World War I sort of period, and then the Roaring Twenties. We see the progressive movement really start to kickstart, right? And they introduce the merit system. So this means basically you have to take exams and have educational credentials and show expertise or experience in these fields, right? You can't just be some political crony, right? And we put this on the books through acts like the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act from 1883. This introduces competitive exams. It introduces protections against sort of political dismissals, right? And it sort of introduces protections from being coerced into political activities like paying dues to a political party, or showing up at political campaign events, these sorts of things, right? We added to these protections under FDR in 1939 under the Hatch Act. Um, we've also seen in modern times equal pay rules, right? Anti-discrimination laws, and even sort of going further with like affirmative action, though a lot of that is sort of being struck down by the Supreme Court in recent years. And then whistleblowing protections, as long as you're not, like giving away state secrets, right? You generally have whistleblower protections where your job will be protected if you're calling out corruption or mishandling of finances or these sorts of things, right? And then a really important act during 1935 is that all of these state agencies, basically under the Social Security Act, had to accept these rules at the state level if they wanted access to federal grants. So it was a way the federal government sort of bullied the states and local arenas to accept these progressive reforms, right, and sort of get rid of the machine politics and that sort of stuff. All right, final slide: bureaucracy in American history, number 3. Another big movement in 1962 was that Kennedy opened the federal bureaucracy to unionization, which hadn't been allowed before, right? And um, what we know is that private sector union membership has been in decline for a long time. A lot of U.S. politicians call labor sort of communist, and there are tangential ties there, but many labor movements are just about sort of providing a voice for workers against their corporation, right? But we know that government public sector workers, as union members, are a pretty high proportion. Like 1 in every 3 members of the government bureaucracy is in a union, whereas only, I think this is actually higher now, closer to like 9 to 11% of private sector employees, because union feelings have been changing in modern times, especially after sort of the 2007 2008 Great Recession and collapse, the rise of the 99%, the rise of the Tea Party, right? Like a lot of people are frustrated with this corporatism. And so you're seeing a rise in agreement with unionization. Okay, that's all I got for you today. Remember that we will be back on Wednesday. And again, apologies for missing Monday. Thanks for being here and have a great day.